So the modernists are saying, let's become more progressive so that the world will see that we are relevant. The fundamentalists are saying, let's just attack those modern ideas and offer Christianity as an alternative, whereas evangelicals continue, I think, to do what the revivalists were doing in the Age of Reason, which is continue to preach the gospel in season and out of season. And as Tim said last week, we're going to present that same gospel in new and different ways as we see culture changing around us and engage with culture, but we're not changing our message.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Third Space Studio, and we're here on the Shock Absorber podcast. Thank you for joining us, whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us on your favorite podcast app. I am joined, as always, by the fabulous duo of Tim and Stu. How are you guys?
Going really well, thanks, mate.
Yeah, I'm good. I thought you were going to say indomitable for some reason. I don't know why that word popped into my mind. That popped into my mind.
Yeah, the two indomitable lions of the Shock Absorber podcast. And
it's terrific being here, Joel.
That's great. I was going to comment on your shirts, but we won't do that this time. It's great to have you on board with us, because last week we talked about the Age of Reason, which was quite an interesting way to see where evangelicalism came from. And this time we are going to talk about the Industrial Revolution and the impact it had on evangelicalism. So, as you know, we've termed this series Whatever Happened to Evangelism, and we're trying to look at what is impacting the way that we are evangelizing right now by looking at history and how that's impacted it. And we looked at last week the beginning of a new emphasis on individuals becoming Christians, and how the revivalists were asking people to make a personal commitment to Christ. And that was also within a time of Age of Reason where science and things like Darwinism were beginning. But now today we're going to look at what happened next. And the Industrial Revolution is going to be a big part of it, Stu, which is something that we've talked about previously on other podcasts. But before we get to that, we've got a cultural artefact, and we've chosen the Scopes monkey trial to be the cultural artefact. Stu.
Yes, we had.
Do you want to update us on that, please?
Yes, so there was a very famous legal case that took place in America in the state of Tennessee, July 10th to July 21st, 1925. And in this court case, it was the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, and it became referred to commonly as the Scopes monkey trial. It was almost like a show trial, not a show trial. It was almost like a massive publicity stunt. It was incredibly well known, and lots of people were tuning in with great interest. And basically what it was looking at was there was a contest of ideas in the trial between theology and modern science. And so we were talking last week about the Age of Reason introducing this question: where do we get our authority? Do we get it from human wisdom or human reason, or do we get it from the Bible through theology? Well, by the time of 1925, this argument has developed to such an extent in America that American Christian fundamentalists actually publicized this trial in an attempt to halt the march of modernist ideas, particularly in this case in the trial Darwinism, which we're going to talk about a little later in the podcast. And basically there was a teacher, a high school teacher, John T. Scopes, who was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which made it unlawful to teach human evolution in state-funded schools. And so the trial was deliberately staged in order to attract publicity for the small town of Dayton, Tennessee, where it was held. And Scopes actually originally, interestingly, was unsure if he actually taught evolution or not, but he ended up incriminating himself so that the case could actually be held. And Scopes was actually, interestingly, found guilty of teaching evolution and fined $100, which was equivalent to about $1,500 in today's money. But interestingly, the verdict was technically overturned, and the trial served a purpose in that it drew intense national publicity to the whole thing. And the interesting point about it was it actually swung public opinion in favour of teaching evolution in school. So it was like a public defeat for the fundamentalists. So the fundamentalists, who we'll talk about again later in the podcast, who came along, who were Christian evangelicals who who were politically active evangelicals trying to politically challenge modernist ideas in the courts and through politics, actually had this public loss. And I think what's really interesting about the trial is it kind of sets up the second half of the 20th century, really eroding people's faith in the Word of God and in faith itself. So it actually really changed a lot of the dynamic around evangelism, because a lot of apologetics start now coming forward to try and say why Christianity is reasonable in the face of this public defeat of the Scopes monkey trial. So I think that's a really good artifact to not only start the podcast with, but we'll end up kind of coming full circle and coming back to that by the end of the story we tell today.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was watching a little YouTube video that included details about the Scopes monkey trial, and the guy who was presenting it says it was bigger than the O.J. Simpson trial because it created such a huge national media story that they even built an airstrip at Dayton, Tennessee, for the camera to ship off the material that they recorded every day of what happened, and actually became so many people around it that they had to move the trial outdoors. Firstly, because it was hot, but also the enormous crowds that were worried that the building where the original trial wasn't going to be able to hold that many people. Yeah, and obviously it was such a big impact. But Tim, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what do you think the impact of the monkey Scopes trial
Scopes monkey trial.
Scopes monkey trial. Sorry. What do you think happened after that? Like, what did you see? What did you see in your research in terms of how did that affect evangelicalism after that?
Yeah. So one of the reasons it's such a significant cultural artifact is because it culminates, as Stu said, a lot of this slow burn that we saw coming out of last week. That Alexander Pope quote from Newton spoke and then it was kind of taking off that. There was a conflict between faith in the Bible where God spoke and the world was created, or Newton spoke and we understand the world. So which is your foundation for believing? And so even though in that age of reason, a lot of those early scientists were people of faith and they were investigating the world that God had made and they saw that was what they were doing. Again, you've got this slow burn right from, Erasmus before the Reformation all the way through that period into the Age of Reason and beyond, where it's who holds the narrative is shifting away from the church, away from religion, or away from faith to these scientific method. And so we get this great moment in time, cataclysmic moment in time for the Scopes monkey trial, where you've had Darwin and others who have come up through this Age of Reason, the Age of Science, and you have them fighting against faith really publicly, this war of ideas. And so how it plays out from then, and we'll talk about this next week as well as we go into the second half of the 20th century, is you have this continuing split and a really cataclysmic split between faith and science. And so even now it's common to think that faith and science are completely opposed to each other. You can't hold both. You can't be a Christian and a scientist, and you can't be a scientist and take faith seriously. And so that's this, generalization that's still out there, and still people are trying to communicate against. There are a lot of Christian scientists who believe in God and believe the world that He's created and that we can study in a particular way. But the general narrative, and we see this in the rise of the new atheism in the early 21st century as well. People like Richard Dawkins, who just, because he's a biologist, he can rubbish Christianity. And it's people take that for granted. Well, of course, he can rubbish Christianity because he's a biologist, and there's this narrative out there that those two things are so completely opposed to each other, that he can speak authoritatively about how rubbish it is to believe in any sort of religious thing because he's such a good scientist. And so that's this trajectory that kind of has been leading up to the Scopes monkey trial, was put on trial then, and as Stu said, legally the fundamentalists won the actual court case, but culturally they lost the war. And so you've got that infects then right through the 20th century and right up to today.
I think your point there, Tim, is really interesting, that even though this long burn of this perceived conflict between reason and faith, even though most people today would never have heard of the Scopes trial, it really entrenches in the public mind that there's a binary conversation around faith and reason, that you can't actually have faith and reason intersecting, that it's, you see it on Facebook these days all the time, like, Christians just believe in the flying spaghetti monster in the sky. There's no such thing as God, and it's just absolutely ridiculous concept to think about it. And, the public show trial actually really entrenches in people's minds that there's this either or, creationism or evolution. And so creation was actually debated against evolution in a court, which is pretty hard to imagine today that would be the case. But that's what it was just in 1925, not that long ago, really.
Yeah, and there are still tenets of that fundamentalist idea right through today, where there is a segment of the Christian church and people of faith who will still hold that you can't be a faithful Christian and believe in evolution. And then you've got those in the scientific community who say, well, you can't have evolution and be a person of faith. And then you've got people in the middle who are trying to see, well, what if these actually talk to each other? Can they inform each other? And I mean, I'm not a scientist. I've got absolutely no skin in the game in whether the theories of evolution are a helpful way of understanding origins of the universe or not. I know nothing about that. But just culturally, what that does is it creates these polar opposites. And yet there are people who are trying to sort of systematise in the middle and say, okay, well, what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, the prosecuting lawyer, William Jennings Bryan, at the Scopes Monkey trial, faced a lot of criticism after the trial in terms of he was just seen as a real backward person. And I think that's an interesting way that sets up how that actually happened. I was just going to ask the question, though. Last episode, we talked about revivals were almost a response to Christianity being almost on trial. In a sense, with the Scopes Monkey trial, was Christianity actually on trial? And what do you think the response came after this in terms of evangelicals responding to that?
Yeah, okay. So that's a really good setup for this podcast today, because the fundamentalists that were engaging in this trial were only a part of the Christian world. They weren't the whole of Christianity going toe-to-toe with the whole of the modernists. It was a response by some Christians to modernist thought. So what will be interesting today is to look at what were the different responses to modernist thought. Basically, we need to go back to the Industrial Revolution to find answers to that question, which we're going to do today, which I think would be really fun.
Yep, let's do that now, because I think that's a really good point. So the Industrial Revolution, obviously people will think of steam engines, for example, but it had a much greater impact than that. Do you want to, Stu, you've actually done a lot of research on the Industrial Revolution. Do you want to give us the highlights?
Yeah, well, there was a guy called Stephenson in England, and he invented a steam engine. Now, he wasn't the only person using steam in inventions, but what he was able to do is create an engine that was powerful enough to drive a train, a tractor, or a big machine in a factory. And so there was this moment in the late 1700s in England where production would change dramatically, and that would change people's lifestyles. So in England at the time of the invention of the steam engine, 70% of people lived agrarian lifestyles. So by far the majority of the population of England were living on farms, engaging in rural activities. And then this steam engine gets created, and all of a sudden all the jobs in the farms dry up, because what used to take 10 or 20 people now took a machine, a tractor, to do the same job. So the jobs dry up in the countryside, but at the same time these big factories get set up in the cities in England like Manchester, Sheffield, London, and in these new big factories, slums grow up around these factories as they need workers to work these machines. So this was at a time that the British Empire is becoming very strongly established. Steam engines would eventually actually help long-term travel as well around the world, but all these spices and resources are coming in from all over the world. At the time, steel production starts in Sheffield. The steel production in Sheffield would become so big that one city would be making the majority of the steel for the whole of Europe at one stage. The textile industry in Manchester, being fed by the growing colonies in India, were growing in exponential rates. And so what you see is all these people migrating from the villages to the cities. And when they come to the cities, there's actually a big social dislocation, because not only do they not have the same housing that they would have had in their original village, they don't have as many churches anymore, they don't have all the social infrastructure of a village that they used to have around them. And so you get a lot of poverty. the Dickens kind of stories of the era, paint a picture of young children who are pickpockets, who are running around London, living hand to mouth. So Charles Dickens wrote Oliver, and in that book he describes this kind of world. Now, at the time, the crime rates are going up. Lots and lots more people are being arrested, and they're running out of room to put all these people in prisons. And interestingly, it was at the time when they started the Australian colonies, and then of course they're taking a lot of the convicts from London that were arrested for petty theft like stealing bread and send them to Australia. So there's this huge social dislocation around the Industrial Revolution. But what's really happening is there's a reordering of relationships. And once upon a time, people really needed each other. Young people needed old people because the young people had the strength and the old people had the wisdom. But now with the Industrial Revolution, people are actually relating and needing machines more and more in their life, and that would only continue on as machines continue to be invented and developed. And so in some ways, we're still living in the Industrial Revolution because technological change is still continuing to reshape our lives. And the interesting thing is we're becoming less and less communal and more individualistic as a result, because we don't need others as much because we can rely on machines. So this is a really big moment, and many people have pointed to the fact that this is the beginning of, it's part of the age of reason, because science has actually created all these new machines, but it's such a dramatic change in people's lifestyle that we call this the beginning of the modern era. So modernism is this new machine age, this industrial age.
Yeah, right. Since obviously, I did read that economic historians are saying that the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the most important event in history, because it actually helped a lot of people. It caused a lot of people to gain a lot more wealth through a lot of other things that resulted of that. That social dislocation piece, though, is quite interesting because that's where, as a lot of times when something happens, Christians actually go to the forefront of trying to help people. What was the response to that social dislocation? Tim, do you want to fill us in on that to begin with? And you guys both know way more about this than I do. So what was some of the responses to that social dislocation?
So as people are coming into the cities and they're, as Stu said, they're being taken apart from their families of origin, many of whom had been there for many generations, and so that'd be their family lot, their family home. And so you come in and thrown into this big mix of a big city. The other thing that's going on there is that you've got work is happening away from the home. And so because work is in the factory, it's not at the place of residence. So most work that's happening in an agrarian society, even when you've got blacksmithing or carpentry and all those kinds of things, you've kind of got the workshop attached to the family home. And so you've got the whole family is kind of all together most of the time. You've got your family plot farming that's right there. So the whole family is involved in all aspects of...
From basically grandparents to children.
Yeah, well, you likely
extended
to have
family,
yeah, extended family, all being
and
there
village
together.
actually. So village was a whole heap of different extended families. So
yep. And so what happens then when you are taken out of that agrarian society where you've got all of your industry is happening within probably your family lot or the workshop that's attached to your family home and the multiple generations and the village that's a part of. And you come into the city, you have your place of residence, but your work is nowhere near your place of residence now. You have to go to the factory. And men and women are often having to leave their place of residence in order to go to the workplace, which may be a couple of blocks, maybe a couple of miles away from where you're actually living. So that starts that dislocation between the place of residence and the place of work, which if people have listened to some of the earlier seasons of the Shock Absorber, we talked about the third place. So you've got the three different places. The first place is your place of residence, the second place is your place of work or industry, and the third place is the place that you choose to be in terms of forming community. Well, this sort of is one of the first ruptures in that, because it hadn't been that case for when you're in your village setting. It also has a great impact, therefore, on families and where children are. Do children go to the factories with their parents? Do they stay at home? Do they just run the streets?
Or work in the factories
themselves, yeah. And so that way you know where your kids are. Also, early on, there's not child labour laws, which is one of the things that the evangelicals very prominent in bringing into place is bringing in child labour laws. But you do have very young children who are working in the factories, which are open, at least 6 days a week, and so you've got all these different dislocations happening there. You've also then got the question about who's running the household, and so whereas a lot of the work would have been shared amongst all the different members and ages of the household, you now start to see what we often think is now common, where the husband, though, is more able to go and work a job outside the home, maybe becomes the breadwinner, and the wife, if they can afford for her not to also be in a factory, is therefore looking after the home caring. Whereas actually there would have been a lot of sharing of those resources before this point. And so you get these kind of different dynamics coming in, some of which we still see today, some of which have greatly reduced today. But yeah, there's all those kind of different social things coming into play.
It reminds me, like, if you're talking about the children working, that was why they were employed as chimney sweeps, right? Because they were small enough to fit up and down chimneys and actually clear them out.
They also went into the mines too in the Victorian era, and there was the coal mines were. There's many cases of that. Children were also on the looms in the factories in Manchester, for example, and they'd be standing up for such long hours that their bodies didn't actually form properly. So they'd have deformities with their backs, and they'd have hunchbacks, and there was all sorts of different ailments that they used to get from the toxic fumes and the coal dust and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of really concerned Christians were looking at this and thinking, we need to fix this up. There's all these people around us. I mean, the first youth ministry was formed by such a person. Robert Raikes started the first Sunday school in the late 1700s in Gloucestershire, and he basically saw all these kids that were on the street. They weren't learning to read and write, and they were just little Olivers running around the town. So he started to teach kids how to read and write in his own lounge room using the Bible, and then that model started a newspaper, and then that spread right across the world. And in fact, the Sunday school movement was one of the fastest growing movements in the world at the time, and that was kind of like a ministry to children and youth, but it was like considered to be the first youth ministry. So, but you also get Bernardos being set up by Christian philanthropists. You get Christian politicians who are like Gladstone, the Prime Minister of England, was really interested in working out how they could solve poverty. So there was this really interesting growth of Christian ideas that could help solve poverty. The Salvation Army were really big about going into the slums and preaching the gospel to people in the pubs and getting people out of poverty that way. There was a temperance movement that went right across England and America because there was a lot of alcohol use during this time as people self-medicated because of the difficult circumstances they were in. So a temperance movement was another part of that. There was, all these kind of Christian responses. Of course, Wilberforce and Newton earlier had actively campaigned against slavery, and they'd actually brought in abolition in England. So, Christian evangelicals who, as Tim was saying last week, wanted to put their faith into practice, were seeing it as really important to solve some of these problems. And what we'll see in a minute is it wasn't just Christian evangelicals who were thinking about this, but this would also lead to modernist solutions to these problems too, by people like Karl Marx, who was challenging some of the ideas of Adam Smith, because at the time that this was all rapidly growing in the Industrial Revolution, there was a free market that was developing, and Adam Smith was one of the first economists that started to describe how the market would actually eventually help solve most of the problems that would occur. But then Karl Marx came along and said, actually, no, capitalism is actually evil in itself, and we need to overthrow that system. So it'd be interesting for us to look at that in a little while as well. But that's all the kind of context of what's going on in the first half of the 19th century.
The idea that we've touched on a number of times is Christians in whatever situation they're in actually trying to move, they're noticing something like the child labour force that was going on in the Industrial Revolution. What has the impact been of Christians actually doing that? And we talked about Wilberforce trying to end the slave trade, for example, in Great Britain. Why is that often not seen, probably not as well known as we think it might be? even though there's people going into these situations and trying to make things a lot better for the people that are struggling, whatever moment it is in history. What do you think about that?
I think it was really known at the time. I mean, it was really quite prominent. A lot of evangelicals were quite prominent voices for social change and social justice at the time. I think a lot of people forget that Jesus was actually the first teacher in history to teach people to think about caring for people outside of your immediate family group or tribe. And so Jesus, in his teachings, talked about loving others as not just those that you were loved by, but you love even your enemies. And so he had quite a radical teaching. And these evangelicals at the time really took that on to heart and saw it as a really important priority to look after people who were outside of their immediate family or their immediate tribe. I think over time, like the Scopes Monkey trial happens in the intervening period, so the public persona of Christianity can change through history because of other factors, and sometimes you can lose sight of what some Christians have done at certain times. But if you look at our country today in Australia, there's still a great deal of social work being done by Christians. It just isn't often talked about. So we're Anglicans in the Sydney Anglican Church, and in our denomination we have Anglicare, and we do a great deal of work for people in Anglicare. We have not only the Anglican Church, but the Catholic Church and the Uniting Church. There's Christians right across Australia volunteering for really good causes to help other people. But yeah, it gets lost within the popular consciousness, I think, that the role that Christianity played in some of those endeavours.
I think I just find it quite interesting that not interesting. I really love to know that Christians throughout time have decided to no, there's something not right here. We need to help people, and that's motivated by obviously their love for Jesus, and Jesus motivates them to love other people, which is really exciting. And it actually reminds me. I was looking at a couple of different revivals during the week in the lead up to recording. And one of them I found was in 1857, the Layman's Revival, which was in America. And that actually started in New York City, where it was a very rough and difficult situation. There was we spoke about last week how there was just waves of generations of immigrants moving over to New York in search of a better life. And similar time to the Industrial Revolution, in England, that obviously influenced America. We talked about the cross-Atlantic relationship that those two countries had. The railroads were a big part of expanding America, and even the stock market was expanding rapidly. But because it was such a real mix-up of people in New York, there was a lot of stuff going on, like gang riots. The country was becoming divided over slavery, which led later on to the Civil War. There was actually at that time 30,000 men living in the street, saying basically we have no food. There was high unemployment, drunkenness was rampant. There was 3,000 people living on the street. So similar to what you've described in England. But that was the interesting thing about the Layman's Revival is that there was a Dutch Reformed church that was part of New York, and it decided to move its mission, to move the church to somewhere else, but leave a mission in its place. And who was left in charge of that was a guy called Jeremiah Lanphier, and he was a layperson and wasn't even actually working, part of that volunteerism movement that we talked about last week. But people weren't coming to church. And he was struggling to ideas to how to get people to come to church. And he just decided, well, I'm just going to hold prayer meetings. So he handed out flyers for 6 weeks, apparently. And then on the actual date, which was the 23rd of December, 1857, only 6 people turned up. And so he was a bit disheartened by that. But 3 weeks later after that, the stock market crashed and made the situation even worse. And then so as those prayer meetings began to build and build and build, and he was a businessman, Lanphier, and he decided to hold those prayer meetings within lunch hours. So within a year, and the newspapers got wind of this, but within a year, 15,000 men were praying during their lunch hours just in New York City. And by the time it had really grown over that year, 800,000 people were actually involved in prayer meetings across the country. There was a statistic that said that pastors were baptizing 30,000 new believers each week, and then that also spread across to England. I think what really surprises me about that is the focus on prayer. And I think that would be an interesting thing to discuss right now is in terms of evangelism, what role does prayer hold in that? And we can see that's having a great impact on society at these different times. do we perhaps not put as much importance on prayer these days as maybe we should?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that you've noticed there, Joel. And we were saying before, just before we started recording, that you've noticed that prayer comes up a lot in these different revivals. And I think that is really significant, because a lot of these revivals are happening in moments where there seems like there are big challenges to the faith, where there are cultural powers at play, where the church appears to be in a place of weakness. And yet what we see throughout the Bible, and also now as we see throughout church history, is that God works in those moments of weakness. We see that when Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, those who are meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, who are merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, persecuted. That's where God is at work. Paul talks in 1 Corinthians about how the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, and it seems to be a weakness to those who are in political or cultural power. And when those things happen, when the church and theology and Christians seem to be in a place of a lack of power, or seem to be in a place of weakness, it is a point where we're drawn to prayer, because I think God gives us the gifts of prayer, and one of the great joys of prayer is to recognise, actually, I don't have this. We don't have good strategies that are working. We don't have these, nice shiny products or these kind of things. It's actually just a dependence on God. And that's one of the things that God loves, is when his people call out in weakness and say, we need you to work. We need you to do your act of regeneration, and we are willing and able to go and speak the gospel to our friends. We're willing to evangelize, to share the gospel with neighbours and the public, and to hold these meetings where people invite people to come, but a dependence on God in prayer, and that recognition that he is the one who is actually at work, and we are just faithful co-workers, faithful servants. That's where God loves to do his work. And so it's not a surprise to me that we see these moments throughout church history. We see it particularly here in 1857 in New York City, where it's the call to come to pray with no other agenda at that point, with the guy who's hosting them, that other than
Lamphere.
I was just trying to find his name, Lamphere. Jeremiah Lamphere comes and says, let's just come and pray together. And he does the work. He's a co-worker. He sends out those pamphlets. He's out there. He's trying to communicate the importance of this, and he's trying to share the gospel, the message of Jesus. And yet even that first one, as you said, is a moment of weakness. There's 6 people who turn up after how many weeks of distributing pamphlets. And yet it's that dedication to say, well, no, I'm just going to pray. And when lunch hour comes every day of the working week, we're just going to gather and we're going to pray. And the fact that grows to such a huge extent, it's 15,000 men praying during their lunch hours in New York City. That's huge. But again, it's because God is working in that place where Christians come and say, we need you to work.
What do you think about the importance of prayer, Stu?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that in the age of reason, prayer seems very impotent. So people would suggest that maybe they can see some good coming out of evangelicals helping the poor by setting up Bernardos. We talked about Benjamin Franklin last week, and he'd say, well, Christianity is your doctrine is of some worth if it actually means that you live a better life. So people of reason will see that and go, oh, that's really profitable. But what people of reason don't understand is that evangelicals are helping people with their practical needs and helping them understand that in the context of their eternal salvation too, and encouraging them to meet Christ as their greatest need. So while there are temporal needs that we help people with, we also help people with their greatest need, which is to meet Christ. And prayer is seen as quite a weak thing. I mean, I was having a coffee with someone this morning before the podcast, and he was telling me a story. At the time of recording, Russia just invaded Ukraine yesterday, and on the TV there were pictures of Christians in Ukraine kneeling in the snow praying, and that was quite a confronting image. And then in The Economist last night on their website, there was a Eastern European writer of The Economist who lives now in America who was saying that he was praying for peace and praying for the Russians and the Ukrainians. And one of the comments on his Facebook feed that he got was, "Oh, great, what good is that going to do? What good is praying going to do?" And yet if we go back to Jonathan Edwards that we were talking about last week, this is what he says about prayer. He says, "There is no way that Christians in private capacity can do so much to promote the work of God and advance the kingdom of Christ as by prayer." So there's this understanding for Christians that we're partnering with Jesus as he is doing his work. So the work we do on his behalf, we are partnering with him as he is doing his work. So it comes back to what we were saying last week, that this is a spiritual endeavour for evangelicals, that prayer goes hand in hand with practically helping people. And elsewhere, Edwards was even stronger. He said, "It is God's will through his wonderful grace that the prayers of his saints should be one of the great principal means of carrying on the designs of Christ's kingdom in the world. When God has something very great to accomplish for his church, it is his will that there should precede it by extraordinary prayers of his people, as is manifest in Ezekiel chapter 36-37. And it is revealed that when God is about to accomplish great things for his church, he will begin by remarkably pouring out the spirit of grace and supplication, as in Zechariah 12:10. So I think that's a really interesting moment for us to understand that in a modernist world that is becoming more and more convinced of the importance of human reason over and above faith, there are Christian evangelicals who are responding to even that in faith. So I think that's the message of that era for me. But the Christian church is not united in that view, and I think it would be really interesting for us to have a look at that, because not only are there evangelical Christians who are still holding to the Word of God and praying and spreading their church's influence through denominationalism and volunteerism, but there's also liberal Christians who are starting to interface with modern thought and actually engaging with modernism and moving away from some of those aspects of Christianity in favour of human reason and making a reasonable Christian faith with liberalism. So we'll talk, I suppose, in a minute about the emerging ideas of Darwin and Marx at this time. Probably Karl Marx is the most relevant straight away, as we've talked about the Industrial Revolution. But yeah, there are some Christians that are imbibing some of these new human thought systems and trying to work out how do we engage with those.
I think it's also interesting. We spoke about moments of human weakness and when things are really difficult, that God moves in certain ways. But then he also takes the innovations as well and uses them for his glory as well. So I was thinking about the road infrastructure in Roman times, all the innovations in the Industrial Revolution, especially the railways. We talked about that in the layman's revival in America. But just going back to another moment of weakness, I just thought of the Ulster Revival, which is another one I was looking at, and that was the Great Famine, which was between 1845 and 1852 in Ireland, where over 1 million people died and another million ended up fleeing the country.
Yeah, it's very tragic.
Yeah, it's awful. And the population fell by 20 to 25% during that time. But a revival happened there, and it was started by a prayer meeting. So it's just interesting to look at, like, revivals often preceded, as Jonathan Edwards said, by a lot of prayer happening prior. So that's something that's an encouragement for us to keep thinking about.
And that practical edge to that too, Joel, is that in Parliament there were Christian politicians who were arguing against the fact that English landlords were forcing Irish farmers to grow cash crops, and that was at their detriment. And then when the potato famine hit, there were Christian politicians arguing in Westminster about how to actually bring aid to those people. But there were others who were more caught up with the ideas of Adam Smith and capitalism that were just saying, no, this is our land, it's our right to do with it what we want. And so as a result, there was a great deal of suffering, and actually probably grew to a burgeoning population in New York, as many of the Irish who fled the potato famine went to New York. I actually was in New York a few years ago now, but they've actually got a monument to the hungry Irish right down in the centre of New York City to this day. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to keep thinking about, is that God keeps moving in the times even when we don't think there is a solution to that. But speaking of possible solutions, you spoke about Marx and Engels before. What was, Stu, their response to what was happening? It was a secularist response. Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah, so Karl Marx developed his thoughts in the 1800s. He was a German philosopher, and he was a critique of political economy. He's a sociologist and political theorist, and he worked with a man called Engels, and they had critical theories about capitalism. And his ideas would actually contribute to a reshaping of the world in the 20th century and actually lead to a great deal of the modern conflicts that we're very familiar with to this day. And in fact, the echoes of his thought are still influencing us today, with the byproduct of many years of his philosophy on the USSR. When that fell in 1991, obviously Putin was a product of that, and then to this day we've still got this division between Russia and America around some of these original ideas. Basically, I won't go into heaps of detail of his idea, but he wrote the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, in 1867 to 1883. His ideas were that he was observing the poverty and the same things the evangelicals were observing, with a great deal of poverty in the cities, but he was also contrasting that with a great deal of wealth from those who owned the factors of production. So the factory owners, he called the bourgeoisie, were getting richer and richer, and the proletariat, or the workers, were getting poorer and poorer. So in Marx thinking, there was these two classes that were struggling against each other, which was a very modernist framework that had emerged since the Industrial Revolution. And he was arguing for a communist society where the owners of capital would actually be overthrown and share that property amongst all the proletariat. And so that led to a lot of communist experiments in the 20th century, predominantly in Russia and then later in China, for example, but right across the world in many areas.
What was that kind of, I mean, we know that communist ideals really impacted a lot of the 20th century, like you're saying, Stu. What was the impact there in terms of Christianity in between those two? I remember there was one of the reasons that Billy Graham experienced a lot of promotion was because he was very much against communism. Were all Christians against communism? Or?
Yeah, I think we could pick that up again in later podcasts, but it's interesting that another thinker, Max Weber, who was looking at the same constructs, he was arguing that the birth of capitalism was really helped along by the Reformation. He argued that Protestants actually were people who actually became a large proportion of that bourgeoisie, this new class of factory owners. And Weber's analysis was that Protestants I don't do his theory justice, but really briefly, his theory was that Protestants didn't smoke and drink as much as Catholics did, and they didn't gamble their money as much as Catholics did, and so they tended to save more money, and then they tended to reinvest their money in the capital of their factories. And so he argued that Protestants really helped capitalism really grow through their investment of capital. So in Marx's ideas and later communist thinkers, there was a lot of criticism towards the church, because there was this idea within communism that the church is actually giving people a false hope of a future paradise and getting the proletariat to just put up with their meagre reality now. So the Marxists were arguing for an overthrow of the system so that people could have a better life now, whereas he thinks there was this the work of the church was actually helping poor people stay poor.
So at the same time that Marx's ideas around the political economy were coming out, there's also the idea of the ideas that are coming out of science, and in particular Charles Darwin. He had a big effect on how we actually thought about Christian teaching. Later on we can look at the fundamentalists and modernists. But what was Darwinism's impact in terms of in that late 1800s period? Yeah,
so Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and he died in 1882, so he's in the same period of time that we're talking about here. He developed a theory of biological evolution where he talks about species that arise and develop through natural selection. And so he and many of his contemporaries begin to really think about that. He wrote a book called The Origin of Species in 1859, and that really turned European thinking on its head, and it actually introduced people to the concept that maybe the evolutionary process was something that actually human beings evolved from other life forms, particularly from apes, and that actually was seen as a challenge by many Christians who, from the account of Genesis, God actually made human beings to be separate to the rest of the animal kingdom. And so that created a big discussion that would come to a high point in the Scopes monkey trial later in the 20th century. Yeah.
So those two things are coming together, Darwinism and Marxism/communism, as we would call it. And then at the same time it's coming out, it kind of impacts at the same time in the US of the Scopes monkey trial, Tim. So what is its impact of, I mean, that's when there's that split between fundamentalism and modernism. How is that happening around in America, and what's the later on impact coming into the 20th century?
Yeah, so to go backwards just a little bit, so modernism comes out of a lot of the theological thinking that was happening in Germany and on the continent. And so what they're trying to play around with is they're taking on some of these modernist ideas and they're thinking, do we need to reshape our understanding of the Bible and how we understand the Bible, how we understand theology and God and all of those things in response to some of these modernist ideas that come from Marx and Darwin and Freud and others like that. And so as they're trying to put that all together, they end up with a theology which has a lower trust in the words of Scripture as an authoritative text, and maybe it's not quite as authoritative or as error-free as we've thought up until this point. And so perhaps those stories from Genesis are not actually scientific and historical facts. Perhaps we need to rethink those and think about them, and as we try and mesh Darwin's insights into that. As we look at Jesus, the virgin birth story and the miracles that he did, and even the resurrection, maybe we need to realise that in this age of scientific reason that those things are impossible because we don't see those things happening today. So maybe that's just a myth from an olden age, whether it was an intentional deception or whether it was just because these naive people thought that things were happening. But we need to rethink who Jesus was, and we need to rethink him. Maybe he was just a great teacher, but didn't do those things that he did. How would we actually even know that he did those things? Because we're losing the trust in the Bible as an authoritative source. Yeah. So this is huge for Christianity because it does start to go and influence large sections of the Protestant church, particularly Catholic and Orthodox church as well. But within the Protestant world, it's really, really significant. You end up with this liberal Christianity, which is lowering the authenticity of the words we have in the Bible and saying, well, no, we need to take on these insights from the secularists and those who are new insights in all these other areas in this modernist age of reason world, and we reassess our understanding of the Bible because of that. And so that becomes, as I said, really influential, and whole denominations start to take this on, and so denying virgin birth, resurrection, miracles, the age of the earth that you would get if you were just adding up the genealogies in Genesis, maybe things like Moses and the Exodus, even the stories of the kings, all of these, everything comes up for question. And to answer the questions of can we trust this text, the answers to those questions are found in these modernist ideas, the ideas of Darwinism and science, Freud and psychology, Marx, and our understanding of politics and the working class and those kinds of things, and all of that comes into play there. And so that modernism, we get a modernist Christianity, and we get people who are saying, yeah, of course we're Christians, but we're just redefining and we're rethinking what that means in light of these new insights that the Age of Reason have thrown up for us. So what that produces then is a counter response where we have the fundamentalists. And so the fundamentalists are those who believe in the fundamentals of the Bible, and they write a whole lot of tracts that outline what they believe are the fundamentals of the Christian faith. These are the things you must believe if you are to be a Bible-believing Christian. And so they write these pamphlets and these documents, which are called the fundamentals. And so those who believe in that become the fundamentalists. And this leads to the early late 19th, early 20th controversy, the modernist fundamentalist controversy, where these are playing out, particularly in America, is where we see it really shaping up as this battle in the denominations. The Presbyterian Church in the Americas splits because of this controversy. You've got a lot of things happening north and south, kind of as splitting over this, where you get a lot more of the northern states. The Christianity that's being played out in the northern states tends to be a little bit more of the modernist. Those in the southern states becomes more fundamentalist. Obviously, that's a very broad brushstroke, but that playing out in those kind of different ways. And as this comes on over and over, you can see where the Scopes monkey trial then fits in, because that is where you've got the southern states, and particularly in Tennessee, where they're trying to hold on to the fundamentals. You've still got this strong cultural Christianity that is using the Bible as an authoritative text, and their interpretation is that therefore you've got young earth creationism, and therefore what we're seeing in the modernists who are trying to adapt Darwin into their theology are anathema. And we cannot have that as part of our teaching, because we want to pass on to our children in the schools an orthodox, authoritative word from Genesis as being how we understand the origins of humans and the world. And so that's where the conflict comes in, and it gets then pressure tested with the Scopes monkey trial.
It sounds like a very divisive moment. Stu, what do you think how did that have an impact on evangelizing? Because if you're evangelizing but to a different, very different set of beliefs and doctrine, how's that going to impact a country like America is going to experience this quite a split as Tim described? What do you think?
Yeah, so as Tim explained, there's different responses to modernist thought, and so how Christians engage with these new modernist ideas like Darwinism we talked about, Marxism we talked about. Tim mentioned Freud, Sigmund Freud, who is considered to be the father of modern psychology. He considered Christianity to be a medieval illusion. It was a neurotic obsession of people who basically had issues. And so, you get some modernist liberals, modernist Christians who are seeking to engage with these ideas. And then there are evangelicals who are continuing to preach the gospel, and in the tradition of the revivalists and the Great Awakening and some of the stuff we talked about last week are continuing to preach the gospel. And what you've got here with the fundamentalists is an interesting moment, because George Marsden defines Christian fundamentalism as politically active evangelicals. And so what you've got now, it's more complicated than this, but for our purposes today, we see the modernist Christians who are embracing new modernist ideas and seeking to evangelize by becoming more reasonable. And then you've got evangelicals who are continuing to preach the gospel. And then you've got these fundamentalist evangelicals who are going to become politically active evangelicals. And so, yes, as Tim said, at the beginning of the 20th century, they had the fundamentals that they wrote, which was basically the summary of that in 1910 at their General Assembly. The General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 1910 is a good summary of the fundamentals. They included biblical inspiration and the infallibility of Scripture, the virgin birth of Jesus, the belief that Jesus' death was on the cross was an atonement for sin. They said that the bodily resurrection of Jesus is an important aspect of the Christian faith, and historical reality is behind the miracles. They're real. So while the liberals were downplaying the historicity of the miracles and maybe saying that they were just the first generation Christian explanations of what was going on, but as we look for the historical Jesus, they were trying to go beyond those sort of mythic superstitious kind of ideas as they saw them. The fundamentalists were saying, well, let's get back to this biblical Christianity in these fundamental ways. But unlike the evangelicals of the Age of Reason, they're actually going to get politically active in their response to modernism, not just continue to preach the gospel and help the poor. And so what the fundamentalists do in the first half of the 20th century is start to engage politically with these ideas, and that comes to a high point at the Scopes Monkey trial, where it's the fundamentalists who bring Darwinists to court and see if they can defeat these modern ideas. So rather than speaking the gospel into a modern world, they're trying to defeat the modern ideas with biblical ideas politically. And so that doesn't end in 1925. The second half of the 20th century, you get a continuation of this fundamentalist engagement with culture like that. But increasingly, the popular mindset of people is that the fundamentalist arguments are actually eroding people's faith in biblical Christianity rather than helping them to grow a deeper respect for it.
That's interesting. At the same time of the Scopes Monkey trial in 1925, 5 states in America had banned the teaching of evolution, as you were saying. So there's that split between the fundamentalists and the modernists. But there did seem to be quite a few people saying we don't want to belong in either camp. We want to become together and be what they originally called a neo-evangelicalism, I believe.
Well, I think that's a continuation of that revivalist sort of evangelicalism that we looked at last week, because that was why we went there, so that we could understand the origins of that evangelicalism. So for me, the way I look at it anyway is you've got this evangelical tradition continuing on all the way through this modernist era, but now you've also got these fundamentalists who are evangelicals who are trying to be politically active, and you've got modernists who are liberals who are holding the Bible's stories more loosely in light of modernist ideas. But yeah, what you'll see in the second half of the 20th century is the evangelicals again come to prominence, so that as fundamentalism loses its place, I suppose, the evangelicals are shining brighter. And we'll talk next week probably about people like Billy Graham and those and John Stott and those people of the 1950s and their generation that began to be real strong leaders of the evangelical movement.
Yeah, I think so. I think I like that you're wrapping it up, because the last question I was going to ask was, there is that evangelical perhaps third way and inspired by the Great Awakening revivalists. I know that in 1947 Fuller Seminary was established, and that was almost the first neo or evangelical college that was set up. But I'm just wondering, there's that big divide. As Christians and people that work in ministry yourself, how does that inspire you to minister and to evangelize? You've got two groups that are very split apart. How do you do the third way, kind of as the evangelicals are trying to do in America? What inspires you?
Well, I mean, I think our church at Soul Revival we consider ourselves as evangelicals. I mean, we're going to talk about that again in coming weeks, about this whole idea of evangelicalism and how even though the fundamentalists kind of petered out after 1925, most evangelicals were seen as fundamentalists. And not only do you get the revivalist moments of the Jesus movement in the 1970s, but you also get the election of Reagan in the 1980s, and there's the moral majority that gets a second wind almost through the 1980s. So there's this confluence in the public mind between fundamentalists and evangelicals, and I think that's carried over to this day. And many younger evangelicals are really quite nervous about calling themselves evangelicals now, because they're seeing this political evangelical or fundamentalist that George Marsden would describe them as the same thing as evangelical. And I think part of my hope in this podcast series is that we see a difference between evangelical and fundamentalist, that there are politically active evangelicals called fundamentalists, and the whole Trump phenomena more recently, where a great deal of Christian leaders got behind Donald Trump, is seen as evangelical. But I would be interested what our viewers and listeners think, but I would see that as more of a fundamentalist impulse that's re-emerging, where evangelicals who want to become politically active again associate themselves with Trump, whereas right through all of this time, there's been this undercurrent of evangelicalism where people have continued to preach the gospel and not be politically active evangelicals. And so evangelism for fundamentalists is attack modernism and offer Christianity as a response. Evangelism from modernists is, let's make Christianity more reasonable, and people will want to accept the Christian faith if it aligns more with the culture, which is a massive thing in our denomination, the Anglican Church in Australia and today, you know, there are great debates going on at the moment. We might look at some later in the podcast about, you know, how are the ideas of the sexual revolution impacting on the views of modernist Christians or liberal Christians in Australia. We are in Sydney, Australia, and the Sydney Anglican Church is continuing to be very strongly evangelical, and that is coming up against that modernist kind of tradition. So the modernists are saying, let's become more progressive so that the world will see that we are relevant. The fundamentalists are saying, let's just attack those modern ideas and offer Christianity as an alternative, whereas evangelicals continue, I think, to do what the revivalists were doing in the Age of Reason, which is continue to preach the gospel in season and out of season. And as Tim said last week, you know, we're going to present that same gospel in new and different ways as we see culture changing around us and engage with culture, but we're not changing our message in line with what Jesus says in Mark chapter 1 verse 14, that the gospel is that he has come to bring in the kingdom, repent and believe the gospel. So for me, evangelism continues to be that, and I see myself more in line with those you know, people like George Whitefield than I do with fundamentalists or modernists. So I think for our listeners and viewers, it's, you know, there are other traditions too we haven't talked about on this podcast today, but it's really important for you to think about, what is my framework? What is my Christian framework that I'm presenting when I talk to people? And what kind of thoughts do people have because of some of the consequences of these debates over time? So if I'm talking to someone who thinks that Christianity and science is a binary question and you can't be scientifically informed and be also informed by your faith, as someone who is taking on my faith as my greatest authority, I'm able to engage with that person, but say, I do. I really am fascinated by space. I really am fascinated by Big Bang Theory and black hole theory. And, you know, just 2 nights ago, my wife and I watched a documentary on black holes, which I think I understood a third of. But, you know, as a Christian, I'm fascinated by that. And I think there's a tradition of evangelicals who are in the world of science that have actually been really interested in how has God set up his world. Isaac Newton was a Christian evangelical who was really interested in that. So he wouldn't have seen science and Christianity as a binary thing. So, I think today is really helpful for me in seeing that modernist approach, the fundamentalist approach, and the evangelical approach as 3 different frameworks, and getting our listeners and viewers to think about, and we'll introduce some new frameworks that have emerged recently too that people might want to think about too, but what is that presentation of the gospel that you feel you are involved in, and for the evangelical heritage to be something we can still be confident in and still present the Bible in our modernist context.
Yeah, I really like that. Tim, what do you think in terms of evangelizing and in what you're inspired by the division between what is it? Modernism and fundamentalists, sorry.
Yeah, I think the thing that resonates with me during all this history is the way that evangelicals are seeking to continue to hold on to the foundations of the faith. And we see there in the fundamentalist modernist controversy 2 ways in which you can be pulled away from that. You can be pulled right towards sort of a political activism and the fundamentalists kind of way, in the way that they reacted to right against the modernists. You've got the modernists' idea that you can question the Bible and the authority of the Bible and use the new knowledge that's coming out of scientists and the Age of Reason to reassess what we think about the Bible. And evangelicals are seeking to try and hold the line and say, no, we're holding on to the authority of Scripture. We've got orthodox theology. We know who God is and who he reveals himself to be in the Word, and who Jesus is, and the message of Jesus that goes out and transforms lives spiritually and for all eternity as we become adopted into his family. And then as those Christians look around their world and they want to continue to make changes as they see that go forward, and that evangelicals are towing that line. And what we'll look at next week is, as we enter the postmodern era and we start looking at what comes out of that in the second half of the 20th century, is we have a group of people, particularly in America after this fundamentalist modernist controversy, who label themselves neo-evangelicals because they want to continue in that train of thought. They want to continue in that heritage that we've seen over the last 2 episodes from Whitfield and Wesley all the way through to now and say, no, that's the progression of history. That's where we want to align ourselves with. We want to align ourselves with these people. And what is that going to mean in this post-fundamentalist, modernist controversy world that emerges from the 1940s onwards?
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a good way to wrap it up. Thank you very much for your time. We'll go into the 1950s and 1960s next week as we look at postmodernism, as you said, Tim, and also revivalists like Billy Graham and John Stott, people like that. But to wrap it up, thank you very much for joining us, guys. Thank you for being part of the Shock Absorber, and there are ways you can continue to be part of the Shock Absorber where you can email me a question. That's joel@shockabsorber.com.au. You can jump on our Discord, which the link for that will be on the show notes. And also continue to subscribe or chuck a comment in the YouTube comments if you feel like it. But thanks again to Tim and Stu for your time. Really appreciate
Thanks, Joel.
it. Thank you to our listeners and watchers. And as always, we like to finish with a one way.